I'm Gene Coletta, editor of the Latin America Advisor publications at the Inter-American Dialogue in Washington. According to the United Nations, the COVID-19 pandemic could push as much as 250 million people into the brink of starvation unless there is swift action to provide food and humanitarian relief to the most vulnerable. Joining us to talk about this issue and its impact on Latin America is Devry Boughner Vorwerk. She's the CEO of DevryBV Sustainable Strategies. She joins us from outside Minneapolis. She was also previously Chief Communications Officer and Head of Global Corporate Affairs at Cargill. Thank you again, Devry, for joining us today on this important topic.
Thank you, Gene, for having me.
Well, as we talk about food security and insecurity in Latin America amid the pandemic, could you tell me a little bit about how you see the situation now with food insecurity in Latin America as the world is dealing with COVID-19?
Sure. Thank you for the question. What I like to point out when I talk about the COVID specific situation as it relates to food and the supply chain and availability of food is, I do like to remind folks that we were facing a food crisis prior to COVID-19. So now we have a double burden of a food crisis globally. The statistics before COVID-19 were about 820 million people worldwide were food insecure, and that food insecurity number has been ticking up in the last couple of years. Prior to COVID-19, there were about the estimates around Latin America, the latest estimates of last year were that about 43 million people were food insecure or going hungry. And as a result of COVID-19, what we have seen is that food insecurity is intensifying, and especially across the Latin American region. In fact, of the report that you were referring to, a recent report that came out in the last couple of days, David Beasley of the World Food Program made international news, thank goodness, to raise the attention to what's happening on the food situation. That identified those most vulnerable now, what they call crisis, which is the intense crisis. And 10 of the top countries worldwide, 10 of them are in Latin America, Haiti and Venezuela at the moment. That doesn't mean that others aren't about ready to reach that crisis level. What we've seen, and as it relates to Latin America, is that commodities across the board, the World Bank reported that for most of the food commodity prices fell anywhere between 10 to about 30%, except for rice, which had sort of some other sort of shortage and production abilities. Everything from soybeans to wheat, et cetera, have been falling. And so what we're seeing is an intensification of all the underlying factors increasing the food insecurity equation.
Oh, and when we look at the supply chain for food in Latin America and the Caribbean, could you tell me how you see that and what problems, if any problems in the supply chain for food in the region is causing for Latin American and Caribbean residents getting food onto their table?
Right. One thing that many people may not know if they haven't visited Latin America is that it has an incredibly robust food supply chain and is moving and has moved up to quite a sophisticated level on the supply chain, the production of processed foods, et cetera. And in the current situation, it's not unlike other parts of the world. The food supply chain is robust. What consumers in Latin America may be seeing across the board in the grocery stores is a reaction to the fear that the food supply chain may not be robust in the middle of this pandemic. So you are seeing shortages on the shelves across Latin America. That's a reaction. That's panic buying. In some instances in Latin America, the challenges are that maybe some citizens aren't able to panic buy as much because it comes into, how often they're getting paid, et cetera. But we're definitely seeing shortages on the shelves. Now, as it relates to the food supply situation, it's robust. Food insecurity has never been an issue of productivity and availability. It's been an issue of access and distribution and affordability. And that's happening across the board in Latin America. One thing to especially note is that a lot like what's happened in other parts of the world is that you're seeing a massive shift from sort of the food service, folks liking to go out and actually eat in restaurants, what's happening is the shift is now going to people being housed at home. And so consumption patterns are different. The ability for consumers to get out and purchase is different, but there's been actual demand destruction in the supply chain. And what I mean by that is it's not a one-for-one, Gene, when we say, well, gee, if there's an availability of food, why isn't it making it to the consumer? The challenge is that it's not a one-for-one from food service right into retail, right into the consumer's home. So there's a lot of products that may go into food service that are not one-for-one when it gets to trying to make their way into the consumer's household. So that's where we're seeing the real breakdown is, and in fact, you're seeing not only the demand destruction, the destruction of food, right? So that's the big challenge. How do countries and communities begin to pivot, because there is availability, but it's not making its way to the consumers. The final thing I will say is that in some instances where you have very dense populations of incredibly poor people, when they're being asked to house at home, they're being asked to house together. And so the social distancing is incredibly difficult. And the tragic part of this is that in a lot of these communities, whether they're favelas in Brazil or other communities across Latin America, people are having to choose between social distancing or being able to get food, go out and get food. And so this is a real challenge.
And as the region faces these challenges, could you tell me what you think governments should be doing and what NGOs should be doing in order to address these problems and make sure their populations get fed?
Sure. What governments and NGOs and private sector is a huge part of this should be doing is what they should be doing at any time, even not in crisis, is working together. And in fact, the situation is so dire that, in some instances, when you think about some of these economies in Latin America that do depend on trade, right, of the commodities, and if commodity prices are falling, that means that governments overall sort of revenues are also falling if they're dependent on commodity exports, et cetera. So they may have less in their treasuries to be able to put toward some of the, the social issues they're facing. What I would say is, one, they need to work together. So establishing task forces, which I know are happening at the national levels, but also at the community levels, is critical. Governments should be prioritizing expenditures on food security and social safety nets and targeting those most vulnerable communities. The other thing that that governments should be doing is taking a broader view of what's happening versus a more careful view. And what I mean by that is shutting borders to cross-border movement of food is not going to be the answer. Sometimes there's an optics of, why are we exporting this if we're concerned about our food supply in our own country? And it's not the way to be looking at this, for example, because they're also importing things that they may not be producing. So governments need to prioritize expenditures on the social safety nets and the food and hunger situation, but they also need to be prioritizing good public policy. The private sector, I've seen some really good examples, Jean, of the private sector stepping in, doing things like reprioritizing their marketing budgets toward actually spending those budgets on critical community needs. And so this is a crisis at the individual level, the community level, the national level, and the global level. And the private sector could and should be thinking about how they're engaging at every one of those levels, and how are they putting purpose before profit in the middle of the situation.
Right, and as you said, I think the answer to all this is governments, NGOs, and the private sector working together, and eventually we'll get through it. Let's
remember, we want to prepare not only and deal with this crisis well, we want to prepare for the next crisis. And we are a globe that is constantly in a state of food crisis. I mean, before the pandemic hit, 25,000 people a day were dying because of food insecurity issues. And so our goal should be, as a global society, to build resilient communities, put in the right public policies with the right safety nets, the right food and agriculture policies, the right trade policies, so that the next time this happens, we've got a more resilient and robust community approach to addressing the food security issues.
Absolutely. It's a definite goal for the future, most definitely. All right, Devry, thank you for joining us today. We'll have to leave it there today. Devry Boughner Vorwerk, CEO of DevryBV Sustainable Strategies and formerly of Cargill, joining us from outside Minneapolis. I'm Gene
Thank you.
Coletta, editor of the Latin America Advisor newsletters at the Inter-American Dialogue in Washington.